concurred in. Debate. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always say what an honour it is to rise in this institution, but as I reflect on the government's response to the report on the Conflict of Interest Act, I have to say that I'm not proud of what has been taking place in this Parliament. We have what's being presented to the Canadian people as a Potemkin democracy. It's a false democracy. Democracy doesn't really happen here anymore. Not really. It's a sideshow that Canadians are being exposed to on a daily basis in a house that has become a circus, an ugly circus, a vicious circus. But what we see here, Mr. Speaker, is the overall attack in this government against the institutions that are supposed to maintain the credibility of the Westminster tradition. A continued, unmitigated attack on the various institutions that are supposed to bring accountability to this place. So as Canadians watch the daily circus show and the silliness and the way the government has dumbed down important issues into little hot buttons that they can press on a given moment, that what we see, Mr. Speaker, is the bigger issue that's being deflected that the Canadian public is not seeing, which is the attack on the credibility of the institutions that would hold some level of accountability. So let's go through the standards that are supposed to be there to ensure a functioning democracy. Now, you'll hear MPs and they'll go back to their ridings and people will ask about the circus that they watch on TV and they'll say, oh yes, but the committees is where the good work is done. Well, when I was elected 10 years ago, I used to think that. I used to think, well, okay, maybe on a given day it may be fairly mediocre in the House, but in the committees, by and large, we were there to do relatively good work, even if it was sometimes very partisan, sometimes it wasn't the brightest. I mean, this is a democratic system after all. It is what it is, depending on who's elected. But the notion of the committee had a place. That's not true anymore. The committees have become circuses. They become kangaroo courts. It's all done in camera, or it's done to use the notion of majority to actually undermine even legislative positions that have existed since the Westminster tradition. You know, in England, in the UK Parliament, it's considered a failure of the committee if there's not unanimity, if you have to bring a minority report. Unfortunately, we're having to bring minority reports all the time. Nowhere is that clear than in the circus of what happened at the Ethics Committee with the review of the Conflict of Interest Guidelines, where we heard from witnesses from across the political spectrum about the need to develop a coherent conflict of interest set of guidelines to hold government, to hold the public office holders to account. And what was delivered to the Canadian people in this report was an absolute democratic fraud. That the recommendations that were brought supposedly through the committee were never even raised by a single witness, and yet somehow the key recommendation, which I will get to, the number one recommendation that this government found in dealing with the issues of conflict of interest. Now, the conflict of interest review had raised all manner of issues, the need for administrative monetary penalties of a substantive nature to ensure compliance with basic due diligence, that people were not just doing things for their friends or their pals, that there were clear rules to ensure that insiders didn't have access, that public office holders were acting in the public interest. And yet the number one recommendation that came out of this committee, and I want to say again, Mr. Speaker, it appeared on our report when we were examining it without a single witness being willing to having brought forward that the definition of public office holder be changed. So this government's notion of who will now be under the Conflict of Interest Act, that members that collectively bargain with the Government of Canada will now be under the Conflict of Interest Act. They will now be public office holders. So what is a public office holder? Well, a public office holder, according to the Act, is a minister of the Crown, a state or a parliamentary secretary. They will now have the same provisions around their conflict of interest as someone who does the vacuuming in a public office building for the federal government, someone working in a call center in Scarborough for the federal government answering the phones is now going to have the same legal obligations as a minister of the Crown. A member of a ministerial staff, so all the little boys in short pants who are writing all these notes so that the marionettes in the front row don't look so slow on a given day, that someone working as a secretarial function in an office in Calgary for the federal government will be treated as having to have the same responsibility for reporting her behavior as the men in the little short pants that work for the Prime Minister's office. That an officer, a ministerial appointee under the governor and council will be treated the same as someone working at a Service Canada outlet, Moose Jaw, Kenora, or Timmins. So what does that mean? That means that there will now be between 240,000 and 300,000 people who are now under the Conflict of Interest Act that the Conflict of Interest Commissioner has to oversee. And the government approved this. They thought this was a good recommendation. They're laughing at us, Mr. Speaker. They're laughing at the Canadian people. This is an absolute fraud of democracy when they decide that a minister of the Crown, who can be bought and sold if there's not clear rules for lobbying and for conflict of interest, is going to be seen to the same code as the person who comes in the evenings at a government office in Winnipeg and sweeps and cleans. Mr. Speaker, the Conflict of Interest Act was one of the key provisions of this government's commitment to have themselves elected in 2006. It's notable that they made this promise that they were going to clean up the corruption of the Liberals in 2006. Their electoral platform would give the Ethics Commissioner the power to find violators, enshrine the Conflict of Interest Code into law, allow members of the public, not just politicians, to make complaints to the Ethics Commissioner. That didn't happen. And make part-time or non-remunerated ministerial advisors subject to the Ethics Code. It doesn't say anything about making 250,000 Canadians have to apply to be under the same code, a code that has no provisions for holding these ministers to account. There's another fascinating recommendation that the government's brought in. If one of their ministers is under investigation, it has to be kept secret. It has to be kept secret to protect their reputation. Now, this is a government that believes in maximum secrecy for its members while insisting on maximum transparency of average Canadians. That is a fundamental failure of accountability. It's this government. We had the member for London the other day, the Conservative member, who said, well, if you go to a public demonstration, why shouldn't the government be able to keep tabs on you? That they believe that being able to spy on Canadians is their right, but their ministers, if they're under investigation, well, good luck being investigated now, because the Conflict of Interest Commissioner will be absolutely swamped with the 250,000 civil servants she has to deal with. You ask the Conflict of Interest Commissioner what she thinks of this report, and she says she's extremely disappointed. Well, of course she is, because it's making a mockery of her position. But the Conflict of Interest Office is just one of the attacks this government's been making. Let's look at a few others. Well, we see what they did with Mark Mayrand in Elections Canada, the attack on him personally. The insinuation was that Mark Mayrand, in doing his job, was doing it for partisan reasons. That they wanted to make it illegal in Canada for Elections Canada to be able to tell Canadians about their rights to vote. And international observers said that if Canada went down this route, it would fundamentally undermine the basic notion of democratic accountability. We saw how they attacked the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Kevin Page, one of the most respected civil servants that I've met in my career, was regularly ridiculed and undermined and attacked. And his job, which was to provide members of Parliament with basic financial data, was interfered with at every step of the way. I have to tell people back home, Mr. Speaker, the House of Commons doesn't oversee the spending that's going on. It's a shell game that happens here. There's billions of dollars spent in all manner of categories, and yet the government makes sure that they keep their members in the House of Commons in the dark like they're raising mushrooms on what they're feeding the House of Commons when it comes to actual information. So the one office to provide basic financial accountability, the Parliamentary Budget Office, was considered a threat, and Mr. Page had to go. So that's another one of the officers of Parliament that's been undermined. We see the latest appointment with the Privacy Commissioner, that the Prime Minister ignored the recommendations of all the experts and picked Mr. Terrien, a lifelong civil service servant, but one with no expertise in the privacy field, and they appointed him above all the qualified people. Now, Mr. Terrien was given a poisoned chalice with this appointment, but as soon as Mr. Terrien was approved, we saw the government go on the attack on him, attacking his credibility, because even Mr. Terrien, without the expertise that was necessary, recognized that the government's bill C-13 and S-4 on wireless, on warrantless access and on snooping of Canadians was a very problematic bill and probably wasn't legal. So we had the Privacy Commissioner undermined. We've had the Parliamentary Budget Officer undermined. We've had the Elections Canada Office undermined. And now with this report, we see the Conflict of Interest Commissioner's office is being turned into basically a farce. And she basically said that she has no ability to keep track of the 244,000 civil servants across this country when her job is supposed to be keeping an eye on a government that's mired in corruption. Now, there's another element for Canadians. These institutions are the respected institutions that provide accountability to Canadians when government does not want to be accountable. There's another key element there, and that's the Access to Information Office, where this government now routinely tells the Access to Information Officer that they will not comply with requests. They will give 300 and 600 and 900 and 1,000-day delays on basic rights to access to information. Canada was a world leader on access to information 15 years ago. Now we're behind tin pot dictatorships in third world countries in terms of providing information to our citizens. And we see the Treasury Board Minister, he runs around like some two-bit flim-flam artist talking about data sets and open government in his Twitter account. It's a farce, Mr. Speaker, because what they're doing is they're making sure that the real key information that Canadians need is not being made available to them. Department of Defense, the CRA, Justice Department, Indian Affairs, they routinely stonewall and shut down attempts of citizens and journalists to find out why decisions are made. If you do not know who was in the room when the decision was made, if you do not know what kind of source was given to provide that information, you have no idea whether or not you're getting accountable government. And the government undermined that. The other institutions, of course, we can talk about rights and democracy, we can talk about the Round Table on Environment, we can talk about Census Canada, where we now have the minister, I don't know what he is of minister now, was the Minister of Immigration, who's now running around trying to explain why he blew it so badly on the foreign worker program and saying, well, we don't really have any data to go on. We're having to look it up on Facebook and Kijiji. This was the same party that ridiculed and laughed at the Census Canada information that was considered the gold standard for information around the world. There's another institution that they have attacked and undermined, Mr. Speaker, and it's the one institution that so far has stood up to them, and that's the Supreme Court. Because I won't mention the Senate. We would think that legislation, we were taught this in school, that legislation comes from the House and then it goes to the so-called chamber of sober second thought, but it's full of hacks and partisans and friends of the party, and they rubber stamp again and again and again, and they're not doing their legislative oversight. So what ends up happening is the Supreme Court has to address bills. Now, before we get to the issue of the Supreme Court, let's talk about the Justice Department. The Justice Department has a job to review legislation to ensure that it's charter compliant, that it meets the overall legal framework of this country. And we see time and time again that the advice that's brought in is either ignored or it's advice that perhaps is designed to favor their political masters, because this is a government that runs and butts their heads up again and again on the basic issues of Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. and they're beginning to look increasingly ridiculous. But rather than step back and say, we have to respect the Supreme Court, even though they will respect no other institution in this country, the Prime Minister personally led an attack on the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They attempted to bring in a judge who was not able to sit on the Supreme Court. They had legal advice on this. They ignored it. They created an unnecessary crisis. We saw their prostitution law was thrown out by the Supreme Court, and they've gone right back at the Supreme Court, banging their heads against it with a bill that will also be found unconstitutional because it ignored the fundamental issues of the Bedford decision. But nowhere is this more obvious than on the Spencer decision last Friday that talked about the fundamental legal obligation to get a warrant to get access of IP information and cell phone information. Now, I heard one of the parliamentary secretaries the other day saying, oh my God, this is going to mean a 4 to 6 week delay in police investigations. Nonsense. It's a day turnaround. We also have within the legal system of Canada the right that you have, the police have, if they believe that a crime is being committed, they can get that information without a warrant. The proviso is they have to be able to show to a judge later on that there was the urgency and that there is still judicial oversight. This government believes that there is no need for judicial oversight. So we have a situation now where 1.2 million times a year government agencies are grabbing information on private citizens without any apparent warrant. They say it's only being done in the case of extreme threat or terrorism or violence. Well, obviously that's not true given that there are 1.2 million requests a year. But all that being said, we had Vic Taves, who tried to bring in his warrantless snooping bill, and he stood up in his house and told ordinary Canadians that they were on the sides of child pornographers if they wanted to defend privacy rights. Well, they put the run on Vic Taves pretty quickly. So then they came back with C-13, which was going to create the provisions to give legal cover for the telecoms to hand over this information, and Bill S-4, where they were going to allow corporate interests to get at your information without warrant or disclosure to you. And then the other provision, the absolutely bizarre one, is that they're going to now allow your personal tax information to be transferred without warrant or oversight. And they somehow think this is going to get past the Supreme Court. Well, since Friday's ruling, it's clear that it's not. So rather than use this institution for the benefit of all Canadians to ensure that we have clear, definable rules in this country, we're going to see the government running and butting their heads against the Supreme Court and then howling like victims when the Supreme Court does what its job is to do, which is to maintain the legislative and constitutional obligations. Which brings me back to the Conflict of Interest Act, Mr. Speaker. To see this government's response and their recommendations, which will protect their ministers, it'll dilute the act, it's turning the basic office of accountability into an unmanageable and unenforceable branch. It has completely broken the commitment that it made in 2006 with Canadians. And it was very interesting, Mr. Speaker, when we heard from Ms. Dawson, the commissioner, the other day, and we asked her about one of the most serious cases that we've had in memory in terms of a breach of the Act, which is the secret payment made out of the Prime Minister's office to a sitting senator. Now, Section 16 of the Parliament of Canada Act, if you read it, and I'm not a lawyer, but when I read it, to make a payment to a sitting senator to make a political problem go away is an indictable offense. And the RCMP chose not to follow through. The RCMP said, nothing to see here, ladies and gentlemen, move on. And yet when we looked at Corporal Horton's ITO, there were serious questions about who was involved in that $90,000, and it was clearly an issue of a quid pro quo. So if the RCMP is not going to follow through, and the RCMP said that they had received all the legal advice necessary, but they didn't appear to have talked to the Department of Public Prosecutions, who have oversight in this, then the issue goes back to Mary Dawson. And Mary Dawson has no ability to go after the senators. The senators are this closed world unto themselves. But Mary Dawson does have the authority to investigate Nigel Wright, and she says she's not investigating Nigel Wright because she's under the impression that the $90,000 is still under investigation by the RCMP. Now, I find that surprising because I don't know how it could be illegal to receive the money, but not illegal to pay the money. So I'm not exactly sure, and I think Ms. Dawson would do us all a favor if she explained. But this is the kind of work that Ms. Dawson is intended to do, which is to ensure secret payments are not made to insiders, that backroom pals do not have access that ordinary Canadians don't have. This was why we were supposed to have the Accountability Act, and unfortunately, with this motion and this report, this government has signaled that they have no intention of following through on those commitments.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. The honourable member for Charles Wood, St. James, Assiniboia.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his comments. And I hate to bring it up, but when it comes to ethical issues, the NDP have a lot to answer for. Be it the mailings, over $1 million in mailings. We have a situation where the NDP have used parliamentary office space for political purposes. We all know that that is a big no-no. That's the so I'm not sure if Mary Dawson has the jurisdiction to check those items out, but certainly those who do have the jurisdiction have really condemned the NDP for doing something that every member of the House knows you don't do. We don't use third-party printers. We don't do clandestine mailings. We don't use parliamentary resources for political purposes. So I wonder if the member can reflect on all the ethical breaches the NDP have undergone in the last little while.
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you. I think that's a great question because it shows people the kind of circus that this Parliament has become, Mr. Speaker. That we have a report on the legal obligations of an officer of Parliament, and they turn it into a clown show, just the way they've taken parliamentary committees. I don't know if the member was here when I was speaking about how the committees have become a functional joke of this House, that they take that and then they're going to run a kangaroo court, and then my honourable member can't even get his story straight, that the NDP used parliamentary office space. But you know, why not say that? Why not say that? Because this has become the circus that they run, whereas that they get everybody running after some false thing while they're ignoring the fact that they're stripping the basic obligations to hold government to account. So my honourable colleague will no doubt come out next and say that the NDP sank the lost continent of Atlantis and should have to pay it back. I'm sure they'll say that. But the fact is that we're dealing with a report that is undermining the basic legitimacy of this parliamentary tradition, and yet when we see the bozo, the clowns on the back bench jump up and down and cheer whenever the government throws red meat at them.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it is important, and if I may, from the question that was just previously put, important for us to recognize that it was, in fact, the House administration that has ruled that the NDP were breaking the rules in regards to the satellite office and the mailings, and Canadians do have a need to be concerned about the unethical behaviour of their leader on this issue and members of their caucus. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting when you think of what I would suggest to you might be wasting time. The member knows full well that we have been looking towards debating legislation as we wind down what will likely be the end of the session by, let's say, Friday, and has chosen to do this motion, which will no doubt precipitate yet another half hour of bell ringing, when in fact what we've lost is opportunity to be able to bring forward petitions. Today, for example, I was wanting to bring forward my petition on the OAS and CPP, our Canadian pensions, which our pensioners treat as very, very important, Mr. Speaker, and then get on to the government bills so that we can see what we can do in terms of working hard, as opposed to where we've seen the New Democrats on 3 separate occasions move for adjournment, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the member is, why are the NDP and the leader of the New Democratic Party choosing to be lazy and not doing the work that Canadians expect of us to do here in the House of Commons?
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Lazy. I love that from a guy whose leader doesn't show up for work except once a week. But I get a kick out of my friend. He's sort of like the Ezra Levant of the Liberal Party. And so he's talking like, you've heard ethical oil. Well, now we hear about ethical liberals. The issue that we're dealing with here, I've never seen a man who complains more when he's asked to show up and actually debate substantive issues. We're debating the undermining of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner. That's what we're debating here. And he's outraged. He thinks that this is an impediment to the work of democracy because he wants to go home. Well, he can go home anytime he wants. His leader left ages ago, so I'm sure nobody will notice. But our job to look at conflict of interest. Now, I know when the Conflict of Interest Act was first brought in, it was to deal with the corruption of the Liberal Party. And I know that they don't want to ever have any rules on it, but I'd like to think that he would start looking across the bench to his dear friends about the corruption that's going on under them as they dismantle the Accountability Act. So I thank my colleague Ezra. Anytime he wants to discuss laziness in the House of Commons, I think it's a great, great issue, and I certainly would love to meet his temporary boss at some point on the issue as well.
Questions and comments? Question come on side. The honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I certainly enjoyed the member from Timmins, James Bay, who has been a doggedly determined in pushing this government on a whole range of ethical issues, the ethical lapses, the misspending. No government in history, even worse than the Liberals, no government in history has been so appallingly bad, Mr. Speaker, at public accountability. They are just awful. And what they've also done is just destroyed due process. They've destroyed the boy, which, of course, what used to be functioned according to consensus, destroyed that. And now they believe that they can just rule by partisan Conservative decree. And I'd like to ask my colleague from Timmins, James Bay, who has been extraordinary in this House and has more credibility than the entire Conservative caucus put together, on issues of conflict of interest, on issues of ethics, how come this government thinks it can get away with anything? I mean, they've attacked viciously Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They attacked the Chief Electoral Officer. They attacked the Parliamentary Budget Officer. I mean, they simply have no shame. How can they get away with it? And what can Canadians do that want to get rid of this government in 2015?
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague because this is a fundamentally important issue that we're debating here, is that we see that they've turned the House of Commons into a circus. We've seen they've taken the traditional work of committee and turned them into trained marionettes or sock puppets. But what holds Parliament to account are the officers of Parliament. And this report that we're debating here is a serious report because you can look at all the recommendations that were brought forward by men and women of all political stripes who believe in accountable government regardless of what political party you're from. And we see the Conservatives turning this into a circus, and we see the Liberals not wanting to discuss this. We're talking about an act that was put in place to hold government leaders to account, and what they're going to do instead is that they're going to, and this is the ultimate circus and fraud that we're seeing here, 244,000 civil servants will now be treated under this act the same as key ministers, key deputy ministers, as well as the political partisan staff of the Prime Minister's office, that the person cleaning the office in Winnipeg will be treated the same as one of the Prime Minister's insider friends like Bruce Carson. It's a joke.
Questions and comments? Question come on side. The honourable member for Peace River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite spent some time about different things that undermine this Parliament. There are a number of things, and he happens to be one of them, Mr. Speaker. As he's gotten up here, he's criticized every party, anybody that hasn't agreed with him. He's refused to answer any question that's been put to him in this entire debate. The question that needs to be asked, and that continually won't be answered by the member, is when will the NDP repay what they took from taxpayers that was against the rules? Now, it has been ruled by the nonpartisan staff of this place that the NDP broke the rules, took the $1.7 million and took off with it. Now, we're talking also now about the revelations of the scandal that saw the House of Commons staff, paid staff, taxpayers' paid staff, now housed in partisan...
Order. 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 The member is running out of time. We have less than 30 seconds. The member from Timmins James Bay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I say to the folks back home, what kind of mailings have you received from the Conservative Party? Those ridiculous, crazy attack mailings about the NDP and their carbon tax and the NDP breaking up the country and how NDP is a threat to life itself. Think, folks back home, of all the crap you received from the Conservative Party paid for by the taxpayer, and then look at the members on the other side. Do you trust them? I wouldn't.